Who would not like a composition lesson from a great master? Unfortunately, great masters are not common and not always available for lessons. But occasionally history gives us such an opportunity. Brahms Trio, Opus 8, is a case in point. The work was published in 1854, but in 1889 he revised it very substantially. Normally, Brahms was in the habit of destroying earlier versions, but in this case, since the work was published, copies of the older version have survived. By comparing the two versions, we can see where Brahms thought improvement was necessary. The problems with the first version are certainly not elementary, like unidiomatic writing for instruments or mistakes of harmony. The 1854 version is quite a lovely piece in itself. Indeed, if Brahms hadn't revised it, most people would not see any problems with it at all. From our point of view, however, what is interesting is not just the changes made in the revision, but why he made them. Of course, Brahms did not leave comments about the various changes, but he clearly made them because he felt the music was not as good as it could be. In this lesson, we'll look at the scherzo, the second movement, and try to understand why Brahms made the changes he did. They fall into two categories. There are occasional minor textural alterations, like moving the bass from the cello to piano or vice versa. These changes are almost unnoticeable to anybody but a performer playing the piece. They don't affect the overall form very much. Here's an example of this kind of change from the start of the movement. First, the older version of the opening, followed by the newer version. In the first version, starting in measure 5, the cello imitates the piano theme in canon. In the second version, the canon is in the piano alone. Why? I would speculate that Brahms preferred the more vivid contrast created by the piano playing alone for a few bars over the first version, where the cello doesn't stop. But compared to the second kind of change, this is a minor detail. The big difference between the two versions is that Brahms has completely recomposed the coda. Although the two versions of the movement are practically the same length, the second version is only 1 bar longer, the musical content of the coda is totally different. Here's the first version of the coda, starting from measure 422. And here's the second version, also starting from measure 422. Both codas begin the same way, with the cello presenting a variant of the theme in B major, imitated by the violin. In the first version, the violin then begins to alternate little pizzicato phrases with the cello, slowing down into a kind of hemiola, as though the music were in 2/4 time. Meanwhile, the piano continues its light chords over a stepwise descending bass until the pizzicatos come farther apart 6 bars before the end. Then, finally, the strings, arco, and the piano come together for a final sustained chord. Why wasn't Brahms satisfied with this? A great composer has very high standards, so there was clearly some specific aspect of the first ending that Brahms felt should be improved. And it wasn't a detail, since he recomposed the whole section. If we try to think like a composer, can we discover what bothered Brahms in the first version? What formal requirement did he think wasn't adequately fulfilled? A good composer is always on the lookout for what I call dead spots, where the music seems to be going nowhere. These are places where the listener's interest wanes. I would suggest that somewhere around measure 440, Brahms felt that the music lost interest. It becomes too simple, too predictable. The overall effect of this coda is a substantial loss of momentum, losing more and more energy until the end. And around measure 440, there's not enough novelty to maintain interest. Let's listen again with this in mind. There's an arrow where I find that the energy seems to fade too much. Now let's look at the later version. This version first modulates to D major starting in measure 429. Then it returns to B minor in measure 439. But the most notable difference between the two versions is not the harmony, but the texture. Now, in measure 435, the piano brings back an arpeggio idea that we've heard several times earlier in the movement. Then, in measure 444, the cello recalls the main theme, which is then imitated by a rising, repeated eighth note figure in the piano. This is repeated, with the cello overlapping the end of the piano figure in measure 448. Now the piano is an octave higher. This in turn slows down in measure 453 into the concluding repeated B major chords. This version also loses momentum, but much more gradually and in a less linear way, with several short bursts of energy along the way. These little contrasts within the coda supply a level of interest that the first version lacks. Let's listen to the second version again. I think that Brahms revised this passage to maintain the energy until the end. He didn't feel the need to drastically change the actual duration of the coda, but the revised version has a sparkling liveliness the older one does not. Duration in music is not only a function of clock time, but also of contrast. Time passes more slowly when the music has no significant contrasts. Brahms seems to have found that the first version dragged along for too long. In other words, there was a problem of formal momentum. In fact, many problems of musical form are problems of momentum. Finding the right amount of energy at any given moment is one of the most common challenges for a composer's sense of form. Brahms became more demanding of himself as he matured. When we see a major composer revising and making major changes, we can learn a great deal by trying to understand why. This example shows us that maintaining momentum in the form was an important criterion for Brahms. Aspiring composers should add this criterion to an inner checklist, asking themselves whether their own music has dead spots. In this online course, our goal is to analyze while thinking like a composer. Brahms has just offered us a wonderful example of how to do this.